questions you have about gardening. So, a lot of people are familiar with diseases other than viruses in their garden. If you grow peach trees, you've probably seen peach leaf curl, which is kind of an ugly disease. It's caused by a fungus. Or if you have pears and apples and things related to that, you may see fire blight, which is caused by a bacterium. But today, here's a little lineup of the steps we're going to go through in this talk. So what the heck are viruses? How did we find out that viruses exist? What does they look like in the plant? And if they were only in one plant, we wouldn't worry about them. But so how do they get around? How are they transmitted? How can you diagnose which virus you have, which is essential to providing information for management, how to control them or at least minimize their effects. I'll go through some common virus diseases. It's a good time for you to take a nap. A lot of the symptoms look similar, and there are some similar control strategies. And finally, strangely enough, some people use viruses for ornamental uses in plants around the home. So, what are viruses? They are not cells. They cannot reproduce on their own. They're obligate in their host. They rely on the host to reproduce themselves. And they can infect most things, bacteria, plants, animals. They have a coat to keep them warm on chilly nights. No, that's not true. It's usually composed of proteins, and it has a heritable or a genetic material in the center. It's either DNA or RNA. So in the picture, you see a bacteriophage. That means a bacterial eater. That virus is specific to bacteria. Tobacco mosaic virus, which was where viruses were discovered with this particular one, protein coat, RNA in the middle, and human immunodeficiency virus, which has the genetic material and various enzymes and proteins around the outside. You cannot see these with a microscope. You cannot see any signs of like a fungus. You may see fuzzy stuff. You can't see that with a virus. And they have high rates of mutation. So viruses must bind precisely to certain proteins. They have complementary proteins that fit into little other proteins on the cell surface. So they're highly specific. Plant viruses only infect plant cells. So if you're gardening and you have something ugly happening in your garden, you won't catch it. Animal viruses can only affect animal cells, and bacteriophages, just certain kinds of bacteria. And beyond that, in eukaryotes, those are things that are not bacteria, not the lower microorganisms. They can be very specific, like cold viruses affect only the lining in the upper respiratory system, and plant viruses are similar. So here is a plant virus life cycle. So the virus has to get into the host cell. In the case of this bacteriophage, it's like a syringe that injects its genetic material, which goes into the cell, takes over the cell's machinery, reproduces its protein, reproduces its DNA, assembles them, and then disperses, whether it's through mechanical damage that spreads from one plant to another, or insects, or other things that spread the virus around. It takes about from a few days to weeks for the initial infection to become systemic. In other words, it goes throughout the plant, unlike perhaps some other pathogens. And then it's transmitted to other plants, and that closes the life cycle. So a little bit about the history. The virus, the word itself, originally meant venom of a snake. So, you know, if you say something is virulent, you mean it's harmful. So that's the name origin. In 1886, sap from infected tobacco leaves that showed a mosaic pattern like you see on the screen caused mosaic symptoms in healthy plants when that sap was rubbed on them. Boiling destroyed the infectiousness, so they knew it was an infectious agent. Filtration that could take out bacteria, small enough to take out bacteria, the viruses move through, so they're smaller than bacteria. And now, instead of saying the entire name like tobacco mosaic virus, we just say TMV to be cool. Virus symptoms are dependent on the health of the plant and the environmental conditions. Sometimes a plant may be infected, but you won't notice symptoms. The virus usually goes systemic, so okay, you're internet folks, but the original term going viral refers to viral spread. They are very infectious. Now, the virus may express different symptoms in different parts of the plant. For leaf symptoms, for example, we have mosaic patterns. They look sort of like a checkerboard. They're yellow and green spots all over the leaves. They may produce chlorosis or yellow spots, or necrosis, brown spots, yellow stripes, streaks, vein clearing, vein banding, leaf rolling, and curling and stunting. Don't worry, I'll provide pictures of these. So you find a mosaic on this plant. See the dark green, the light yellow, and kind of a scattered pattern over the leaf. Necrotic or chlorotic spots. See the little yellow spots on this bean leaf. General yellowing in the leaf. Stripes or streaks. Vein clearing. In other words, the vein no longer has color. It just looks translucent. And leaf rolling or curling. Flowers have a little bit different problem with viruses. So here you see a tulip infected with the virus, and it has red and yellow streaks. So they call that color breaking when the virus does that to the flower. The virus can also cause distortion of flower parts. As you go down, the symptoms become more severe. So the flower doesn't look like, from here to here, you can see a difference, and color changes as well. On fruit, that's a little bit different thing, and perhaps a little uglier even. Fruit and vegetable symptoms include mosaics, so you see the yellow and green. Stunting, the fruits may become small. Discoloration or malformation. So I know I'll just say personally, I would not like to admit I've ever had a wart. And this vegetable probably wouldn't like to admit it either, but there it is. The virus is producing warts. And finally, on fruit, frequently you have ring spot patterns. So you see the little rings in the tomato and in the plum. And even on stems, although you may need to peel the bark back to see this, there's pitting and grooving in the stem and tumors even. So that's a little on the ugly side as well. So we've seen what the symptoms look like. How does the virus get around? So there's a transfer of sap on tools, hands, even animal feeding, just kind of a mechanical damage, can transfer viruses from one plant to another. Another way is by insects, nematodes, and even fungi can carry viruses. And from one plant to another, just by the plant itself, through pollen, seed, or vegetative propagation from infected parent plants. So you begin to see, in terms of transmission, maybe what some of the control strategies might be. And we'll go into that a little later. So what do these transmitters of virus look like? Well, you're familiar with aphids if you've grown just about anything. Leafhoppers, white flies, thrips, which are very small, and you may not actually notice what they are. See the fringing on the leaves. If you have magnification, you can see that. Nematodes, which are unsegmented, microscopic roundworms, and mites. Fortunately, you don't see them this close up most of the time. So the transmitters of viruses are called vectors. And the virus-vector relationship can be non-persistent, semi-persistent, or persistent. Can be transmitted in seconds, hours, or days, depending on the virus and host. And the vectors can be very specific, only transmitting one type of virus. So to go into the vector virus relationship, non-persistent, they do not circulate inside the insect. They're born on the mouth parts of the insect, and then when the insect feeds, it sort of introduces the virus at the same time. There are persistent viruses which actually move around in the vector or the insect in this case, and they can transmit over more feedings because the virus is always present in their system. Or the virus can be propagated. It actually multiplies in the insect and it can even be transmitted to eggs and nymphs of the following generation of insects. Viruses infect virtually all species of plants. The host ranges of individual viruses vary from very narrow to very broad, and we go into individual viral diseases. We'll see some of that. So diagnosis. Okay, we got a bunch of different symptoms and they look quite different sometimes from each other. How are we going to find out which virus we are seeing, the effects of which virus we are seeing? So infection reduces growth, lowers yield, and decreases quality. You may notice the effect of a virus this way. We can identify from symptoms. So certain symptoms are very characteristic of certain viruses, and they're the most common symptoms. So that helps. If the virus produces a range of symptoms, that's more difficult. We can tell from the host. So certain hosts only have certain viruses infecting them, so that narrows down the number of viruses that might be. And the insect that transmit the virus, if it is an insect-transmitted virus, may only transmit one virus. In that case, it's pretty easy. You have the host, you have the insect, it must be this virus. So you see how a diagnosis might go. And here's the warning to make your life complicated. Different viruses may elicit similar symptoms. And similar symptoms may also be a result of environmental conditions or other diseases. Correct diagnosis may require laboratory tests, which is beyond the reach of most of us, including myself at the present time. So virus management, knowing what the symptoms are, how to diagnose it. Virus identification is mandatory if we are to take the best management steps to control viruses. So management depends on how a virus enters a crop. Does it come from neighboring crops? Does it come from alternate hosts? Does it come with vegetative debris? How is it transmitted? Once it's in the crop, how does it go from plant to plant? And how does it survive when the crop is not being grown? So these could be weak links in the life cycle of a virus that can be exploited for management. So prevention with viruses is the key. As with most diseases, it's most effective. Certified virus-free seed or vegetative stocks, if you're going, say you want things grown from cuttings, you got them at a nursery, you got them for a friend, whatever the case may be aware of transmission of viruses. Eliminate virus reservoirs or alternate hosts in the environment. Insect control, although this can be hard since some viruses are transmitted very quickly, it's hard to stay on top of insect control, and those measures tend to be less environmentally friendly. Modification of planting and harvest practices. Maybe you can plant and harvest in a time when the vector or the transmitter of the virus is not present. Care for your plants and make sure they are vigorous. Grow resistant cultivars, they actually do exist. Some cultivars are resistant to viruses and dig out and destroy virus-infected plants. Above all, avoid early infection. So whatever control strategies you use them particularly stringently early on, because early infected plants are more severely affected and you're much likely to not to get anything productive out of your garden when there's early infection. Controlling insects is not effective in woody plants. For one thing, insects at low density can spread the virus. You may not even see the insect. And the perennials have a really long lifetime, so to protect the plant over the life of the plant was difficult. And besides, they rarely kill woody plants, but they may alter the appearance of the plant. Most problematic, and probably what you're going to be most familiar with, are young herbaceous ornamentals, things that are annuals, things that you go harvest, they die, and you start again next year. And certain vegetables especially are especially susceptible to viruses. So brave with us here. I'm going to show you common viral diseases, the effects of them. and vectored or spread by various, whether they're aphids, leafhoppers, nematodes, mice, various vectors. So the peony ring spot, also known as tobacco rattle virus, that would be TRV to be cool, has a host range of over 400 species then vectored by nematodes, those non-segmented round microscopic worms, Trichodorus and Paratrichodorus. So these, I'm not going to go through all the things that can infect. There's quite a few, obviously. So select virus-tested plants, especially if you're dealing with peonies. Control the nematode vector by fumigation or rotation. Fumigation is not going to be an option for you, I don't think. But don't put your crops, if you know you have a nematode problem, in the same place in the ground every year. Remove and destroy infected plants. This is going to be true for almost any viral disease, to get rid of infected plants. So here's how the ring spot virus looks. There are the rings, okay, appropriately named. It doesn't affect the size of the leaf very much, but you see the patterns on it, even some vein banding. Sometimes other symptoms may show up as well. No dwarfing in this plant. So here's what under a microscope, these are what nematodes look like. You probably can't tell one end from another, but there's the business end. It has a little stylet that comes out of there and penetrates the plant. And it persists in the nematode for a long time, which is not good news for the gardener. So how beat curly top virus, another very common virus, is spread by leafhoppers. And these are the crops affected. And you may see leaf wilting, curling, distortion, rigidity, stunting, and death. And I'll show you pictures. So on bean leaves, here's some curled and wrinkled leaves affected by the virus. Early tomato ripening. So if the tomato ripens at this point, you're going to have a miniature salad to go along with the miniature fruit you may or may not get on this particular symptom. And stunted plants. So here's a cantaloupe plant. You may not see a lot of obvious viral symptoms, but why is that little guy so small? In others, with a stunted tomato plant, you see the leaf rolling and curling, and you know something's wrong. Could be water, but sometimes it could be a virus as well. So to determine the difference between wilting from lack of water and from curly top virus, soak the plants in the early evening. Plants does not revive overnight, suspect curly top. No chemical control, as is usual for most viral diseases. Shade cloth early in the crop development may discourage leafhoppers. It helps tomato and pepper plants grow better and produce more fruit during the hottest summer months. Now, the shade cloth should be fine enough to exclude leafhoppers and remove diseased plants. This would be just kind of a floating cover over your plants. So tobacco mosaic virus, this is the virus that was discovered. This is where we found out what viruses are. TMV is one of the most damaging diseases. Here are some host plants. And the leaves are usually mottled with yellow and green spots, and the spots appear thick and raised like blisters. There are other symptoms as well. So here's the dastardly tobacco mosaic virus, which plagued Larry the cucumber and VeggieTales, and perhaps a few other people's vegetable gardens. Proteins on the outside, nucleic acid, or the genetic material inside, and this is what happens to tomato fruit when this dastardly TMV is at work. Mosaic and blister symptoms, especially you can see here the lighter yellow spots, the blisters, shoestring symptom on tomato. The mid vein in the tomato leaf is there, but the leaf blade is not. So it enters through breaks in cell walls caused by insects or mechanical damages. The insects are not per se vectors of this disease, but if there's damage to the plant, the virus can get in. So remove and destroy symptomatic plant. Sanitation is the best control practice. So if anybody smokes or uses tobacco products, you shouldn't do that when you're out working in your garden, because the tobacco mosaic virus may be present in the tobacco product and be transmitted as you're working with your plants. Use virus-free seed. You can bleach it before planting if you have doubts, and it's transmitted by contaminated tools or hands. No effective chemical sprays. Rose mosaic virus, and I know a lot of you are enthusiastic rose growers, is actually a complex of different viruses, although we call it rose mosaic virus because who wants to recite a laundry list of viruses? Yellow line banding in a zigzag pattern in mosaic and watermarking, which are just faint yellow squiggles, are common symptoms, including distorted or stunted blooms. Spring and fall, you may notice this more. It tends to be more normal during the summer, but more asymptomatic. And the damage can be very mild, and plants can survive many years with chronic infections, or they may be more seriously affected, sometimes according to rose variety. Delayed or fewer flowers, grows more slowly, more susceptible to frost damage, which is weird. So the virus looks like this. So they have some yellow veins here. Here's your water marking, or little yellow squiggles. Mosaic pattern. Sometimes the yellow spots merge and you actually get big spots. Ring patterns, and kind of a pretty, some people would call that an oak leaf pattern. No rose is immune. And it's spread through grafts or cuttings, and it circulates through the plant, so you cannot prune it out of your roses because the virus is already spread through the plant. Replace roses if the performance isn't good, and make sure your replacement is certified virus-free. Most reputable producers of rose bushes will index or check to make sure their propagated material is free of virus. Cucumber mosaic virus, of course, it's on cucumbers, and over 150 other types of plants. Mosaic means it's going to be mottled yellow or white with light and dark green spots or streaks, but it has twisted leaves frequently, the shoestring pattern we saw on the tomato plant, and tomatoes are small and misshapen. So on cucurbits, it looks something like this. The leaves tend to be small, wrinkled, twisted. There may be a mosaic pattern even on the fruit. And some plants just generally don't look very thrifty, maybe even with some necrotic spots on the older leaves. On non-cucurbits, a range of viral symptoms depending on the crop and when it occurs. So you see some ring spots, which you've seen before, some distortion of leaves, general disruption of growth of in Brussels sprouts, and so on. So on spinach, here's a close-up, may actually cause death of the younger expanding leaves, and there's the shoestring symptom on tomato again. Spread by aphids and leafhoppers. So for aphids and perhaps leafhoppers, you can use a floating row cover, fine enough mesh to exclude the insects, or aluminum foil mulches to exclude or repel the insects. Resistant plants, control weed hosts. We don't want any alternate hosts that serve as a reservoir for the virus to come into your garden. But once infected, there's no control. So you destroy infected plants and disinfest your garden tools. So here's the reflected mulch. It increases temperature and light early in the season, which may help your crop growth. It reduces insect feeding. The aphids don't know where to land. They don't know which thing is ground. If it's all light is reflected at them from all directions, from the sky, from the foil, they have a hard time finding where they want to go. At least this system would delay the time of first infection, and you know how important that is. As the plants cover the soil, it's less effective since the light is not reflected by the mulch if it doesn't get to it. And remove the mulch when temperatures peak to avoid burning plants. So you may even use foil to get a suntan on your underside. The sun gets too much, you get burned. So cauliflower mosaic virus, yet another mosaic virus. Mosaic viruses are very common. So they tend to be on crucifers, or cabbage, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, broccoli, and so on and so forth. It produces clearing of the veins, or chlorosis, which is yellowing. Later, a mosaic may develop, and plants can be stunted, especially if infected early, and necrotic spotting occurs in stored cabbage heads. So what does it look like? Here's the necrotic spotting. Necrotic means dead, brown. Here's the vein clearing, and more vein clearing throughout the leaf. You can imagine that plants affected that way will not be as productive. Aphids acquire and transmit in 1 minute of feeding on an infected plant, although it's non-circulatory. So the aphid can transmit quickly. If it feeds on non-infected plants, it may lose the virus on its mouth parts. But the acquisition in such a short amount of time makes it very difficult to control for insect control to be effective. It's also spread by infected seed. The temperatures, and this is typical of viruses, there's an optimum range for symptom expression, so between 61 and 68 Fahrenheit. It's often mixed with turnip mosaic virus, and they both add up to beat up on your plants and cause you misery in the garden. So eradicate cruciferous weeds. You may have wild mustard or radish, or weeds we commonly see in open fields. Get rid of those around your garden and incorporate crop debris immediately after harvest to break down the tissue and deactivate the virus. So lettuce mosaic virus, another mosaic virus, and leaves are stunted and deformed and show a mosaic pattern. Now you can imagine if lettuce leaves do this, they're not going to form a head for you. So that's damaging, and who'd want to eat it after that anyhow? So the outer leaves can be yellow and twisted. On head lettuce, the wrapper leaves may curve back from the head, brown necrotic flecks, and developing heads may be deformed if they get far enough to produce a head. So right here, you can imagine when you see the mosaic pattern, you see the leaf distortion. You can imagine that there won't be a head on that lettuce, nor even in the non-heading types, much of the leaf to eat. Necrotic, dark brown spots, mosaic pattern, and even some vein clearing. So, and this one's a little bit unusual. The ants love to protect aphids, and they actually carry them around and take care of them against predators and that kind of thing. So for this particular disease, an attempt to control aphid-protecting ants is useful. Use only necessary fertilizer. Don't get this big lush growth which attracts aphids and consequently virus transmission. You can use the silver reflective mulch or knock aphids off with a stream of water, but transmission may already occurred by that time, so that may not be terribly effective. Resistant varieties are available, and plant tested seed. If you're coming from seed in your lettuce crop, your seed packet should tell if they've been tested, or you can find out. Destroy post-harvest residue. Tomato spotted wilt virus, it also affects, even though this would be TSWV for those on the end, affects many other vegetables as well. So leaf mottling and ring patterns are common on fruit. The plants wilt, the top leaves first and die within a few weeks. And there are many other symptoms. So stunted plants, see how much smaller these tomato plants are. There was a double row planted down through here. You may see some bronzing or discoloration of the leaves. Wilted leaves, yellowed and wilted leaves, and even here are the fruit patterns. Another ugly disease. Spread by thrips. So you remember those insects with fringed wings. You need magnification to see that. No cure. Minimize fertilizer, dispose of weeds. You possibly can control thrips with insecticidal soaps or pyrethrin, but they are very difficult to control. Use resistant tomato varieties and destroy infected plants. So now, strangely enough, some viruses are used for ornamental uses. Some people believe that this enhances their aesthetic value if they have an unusual appearance. But most virus-infected plants are adversely affected in some way. Their growth is smaller. They may have necrosis on the leaf margins. They die off. Oh, and another wrinkle in the use of virus-infected ornamentals is the virus may be okay in the original plant, like this lettuce, tomato transplant infected with this virus, can go to Lisianthus and cause severe damage in Lisianthus. And the salvia dancing flame comes from the virus infection, this virus. If it's in other cultivars of salvia, other salvias, it may cause flower malformations and stunting. So,
Hey, Jeff,
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Since you've moved on to this topic of ornamental uses, we do have a couple of questions about
Sure.
the viruses for vegetables and so forth, and how to control them. Would this be a good time to address them?
Questions from the audience have priority.
Okay, fair enough. So we had a question from Anne, I believe, about bleach as a control method, bleaching seeds, and it's both, can you talk about the concentration of bleach that you would use, and is that a good preventive measure for many viruses, not just TMV, if you can treat the seeds?
Well, bleach, of course, is an oxidizing agent. It can kill a lot of different things, and it's been used as disinfectant and in swimming pools, and not so much for the coronavirus because of other side effects. But it's quite effective that way. 5 to 10% bleach. Bleach is 6% sodium hypochlorite. So I'm not talking about that 6%. But the off-the-shelf stuff that's for household use, there's a stronger bleach for exteriors, but for the household use, 5 to 10% bleach should do it. For an exposure time of maybe 10 minutes, and then rinse it off. You don't want the bleach to remain on the seed. But the different viral diseases are transmitted in different ways, and not all of them are seed transmitted. So if you treat a seed that in a crop that does not have seed transmission, it won't do you any good because there's no virus there to treat. that doesn't necessarily work. A lot of seeds are infested on the outside. The virus is not on the inside because of the way seeds are attached to the plant and the way they develop. So in that case, it helps you not to have a virus come in with the seed. Did I hit what was asked?
I think so. Another question is, you talked about at one point incorporating the diseased plant quickly, and that led to a question from Dorinda. Is it okay to use a virus-infected plant in compost?
Of course, if composts are heated and they're allowed to mature correctly, that should be okay. But those are important qualifications. So in a lot of composts where you don't have a large pile, you may not get uniform heating, and that sort of thing is probably not worth the risk.
Okay. Couple others, if you're willing to keep going. You showed photos, but at least one person, Margaret, is asking whether you can give tips on being able to distinguish the damage on tomatoes from viral damage versus something like squash beetles. And it goes on to talk about other kinds of damage that aphids can cause and so forth. So do you have some tips about being able to distinguish viral damage from other kinds of damage?
Viruses tend to be systemic, which means you will find symptoms away from the feeding point. So that's perhaps one way of distinguishing. Although if you have something like mites, they can produce a very fine stippling over the entire leaf surface. Not outside so much as in greenhouses. So that might be a little difficult. But if you see insect feeding or notice insects in one part of the plant and you notice symptoms removed by some distance, that's systemic transmission of the virus, especially in the young growing tissue. You can't always distinguish one thing from the other. And the other thing is to observe what's going on in your garden. So it's useful to be able to observe insects when they're in action in your garden. If you're out in your garden frequently enough, you should be able to see, in most cases, what insects are affecting your crop. So it may take a little research other than what you see right before you to say, okay, well, I see a peach aphid in my garden. It's a common transmitter of certain viral diseases. I see these symptoms that are consistent with the virus this aphid transmits. And you observe an association where the aphids are, you see virus symptoms. Where the aphids are not, you do not see symptoms. So those are typical disease diagnostic tools, but you can't always tell a difference. Or if you see those bugs that she talked about, as long as they don't transmit, not known to transmit viruses, you can assume the feeding was from those bugs. If you don't see the bugs, then you're a little bit more difficult situation. There are insects that actually inject toxins into plants. And that becomes, if there are a lot of insects, it becomes more difficult to distinguish from viral symptoms. But usually the toxic effects will be limited just around the feeding site.
Okay, I think
So not entirely satisfactory, and I'm sorry about that.
No, I think people should be able to get some tips from that. There are a couple of other questions about insects and insect control. And I think in general, if one is about an infestation with ants and earwigs and using, in this case, sluggo. So I think the question is, if you control insects, are you helping with virus control? And as a side comment, for those of you who are asking questions about other kinds of damage like insect damage, Jeff may or may not be able to do virtual consultation on how to control for insect damage, but I want to point you also to our hotline and the pest notes that are available from UC, and I think you can reach them through our website. But back to the question, Jeff, do we have to be concerned about the ways we control for insects, or reverse it, is insect control a primary form of virus control in our gardens?
Control of insect vectors depends on the virus. Frequently, attempts to control the insect are not effective because the insects may move into your garden from somewhere else. And so that makes it very difficult to control them to a level where it will prevent virus infection. In certain cases, if it's sort of localized in your garden and you get it early enough, and I hate to say this because systemic insecticides are nasty, and one trouble with them even, they would provide an extended time period of control, is if the insect is not killed by it right away, it's still able to transmit the virus, and then it may die. So that's sort of like a Pyrrhic victory. The virus has already been transmitted. But in terms of floating row covers and reflective mulches and that sort of thing, they're perhaps more effective than sprays. And if you can put off the time of infection, in other words, the reflective mulch confuses the aphids, they don't land on the plant, at least the plant would get off to a good start before this method becomes less effective as the mulch is shaded out. And plants that escape the early infection are more likely to produce some kind of crop, even if it's not perfect. So insect control is probably not the most major means of controlling viral diseases. In certain instances, it can be useful.
Okay, fair enough. Before we go on, one last question, I think, on this general topic of control. Where does one buy reflective mulch?
It can be aluminum foil. And a lot of people will just use that because it's available and cheap.
Okay.
Could be other materials, but I wouldn't get too exotic with this in terms of cost. Well, I'm cheap for one thing. Oil should work fine.
All right, great. Well, we'll watch for others of those kinds of questions coming in, but let you continue with your ornamental uses, et cetera.
I have to put a plug in though for the hotline since I'm there most of the time. If you can phone into the hotline, but if you have a certain insect and you know the crop, do a search on your computer, just type in UC and then the host. The host plant's the most important to identify. And if you're gardening, you'll know what the host is. And then just do that search. There'll be these little notes, summaries that come up, and it'll say for your particular crop, what diseases are important and what insects are important on your crop. And then it'll tell you, describe the insect, the symptoms, how to manage it, what things you can do to eliminate the insect or control them. So although I may not be able to answer all questions regarding control of insects, if you do that, you can find some pretty good answers. So going on from there, another disadvantage to use, and you're not going to see perhaps that many ornamentals that are infected with viruses, but if you see things that look like they're infected with a virus in a nursery, sold in stores, I don't think so in stores so much, you might be a little suspicious and do an inquiry, because even harmless viruses can mutate. Remember, we said these are very mutatable pathogen. It can change fairly easily, as you can see from flu viruses and things we're familiar with on a human level. Some insect viruses can interact with other ones. In other words, the plant comes with a virus, insects introduce another virus from somewhere in your garden, and those two together can be even more destructive than either one separately. And most notably, if you know what virus might be infecting some plants, if it has a wide host range and is spread by vectors or insects perhaps that have a wide host range, you shouldn't buy anything like that. And this is a little bit exotic. Most of these things you're not going to have to concern yourself with. But if you're into diseases, you're interested in all different aspects. So what do some of these ornamental things look like? It used to be that tulips back in the days of the 17th century, when the Dutch went nuts over tulips, there were tulips that had stripes and streaks and different colors. That was due to the tulip breaking virus. They're called Rembrandt tulips, although he never painted them. They call Rembrandt tulips because they're colorful, like his paintings were, strangely enough. So more than you wanted to know. Today, most things, tulips you see like this, are a result of breeding. This genetic is not caused by a virus. So you don't get the decline in growth that occurred with the tulip breaking virus in Rembrandt's time. The butyl and mosaic virus, which maybe you've seen, we do see this in the nursery fairly commonly. The mosaic pattern, yellow spots, green spots. It's sap transmitted, so if you handle the plant and say you went to a nebutulon that does not have the virus, it may transmit it. Causes no apparent harm, but does change the appearance of the plant, positively to some, and other ones don't like it. We have a tulip infected with the tulip breaking virus, the camellia infected with the camellia yellow mottle virus. So the color breaking, the different colored patterns in the leaves, in the petals. Petals are actually modified leaves, so it's not too surprising that leaves could also have different color manifestations on them. There's the butylon again. This is honeysuckle. So you see this kind of variegation in leaf color. Sometimes the veins are different colors than the leaves. Here is the dancing flame salvia. So if you like that, you could get it. If you have other salvias in your garden, it may do this to them. Well, it produces leaf puckering and yellowing, and then the flower stalks are all messed up. You don't get good flower production when that's in the garden. So it's either all this or maybe you best avoid it. Other ornamental uses refer to more streaking and color variations in the flowers. So here's a violet non-infected. Here's one that has color breaking virus, oak leaf patterns and coleus. So you may see some of these in the market. And then you have canna lilies, various striping and streaking patterns on the leaves. Here's what happens sometimes though. Some of these viruses reduces growth. It causes necrosis or browning in the margins of leaves. This virus can actually integrate into the canna lily DNA. So it becomes part of the plant. And that's a daunting prospect. So this reaches the end, and you may be relieved and never want to see a virus symptom again. But as a little review, we find out what viruses are. They don't have cells. They rely on the host to propagate. They actually kidnap or hijack the cell's manufacturing machinery to produce themselves. A little bit about the history, symptoms, a lot of symptoms. They're important because of the damage they do, and also transmission to non-affected plants. How that's done is very important in control. Diagnosis, so what's your host plant? What insects do you see on it? What are the symptoms? And hopefully, considering all those things, if you look up the plant first, find out what viruses are commonly on that plant, and observe whether or not you have a vector or an insect, a transmitter of the disease, and what its range is. So maybe that particular thing you see is an aphid that only is known to transmit one kind of virus, which is also found on your host plant. There you have it. And that will influence your management, a lot of management and sanitation, alternate hosts, getting rid of them, reflective foil mulches for aphids and sometimes leaf hoppers, effective for that. Sanitation, like don't smoke and handle tobacco products out in your garden. I know nobody does that. And then we went through common virus diseases and ornamental uses. So I have to put in a plug for the next workshop, which is on Thursday, the garden guide and journal. So the garden guide provides like a suggested list of things you might do throughout the year, month by month, in your garden, when to do them, maybe a little bit about how to do them, and a place for you to write down what you've actually done, what worked and didn't work, if you're a journal type of person, especially. So 10 o'clock, same time on Thursday. And finally, if you just can't help yourself, these are references about viruses. The APS journals, APS is American Phytopathological Society, which you don't care about, but it is an article generally on viruses, and then various other sources. So this is recorded. This stuff will come to you as a PowerPoint, and you may be able to look some of these up if you so desire. So that ends the presentation, and I'd be glad to field any questions, comments. You can't throw anything at me, including rotten fruit, so I'm safe there, but Anything else you can throw my way, I'd be glad to try to handle. Thank you.
Okay, Jeff, thanks so much. We do have a couple of questions, and I invite people to keep on sending those in for, we have a few minutes.
Sure.
So there's a question, you referenced quickly sanitizing tools, but there's a question about cleaning garden tools from Leslie. What are some of the best practices? How important is that for controlling viral infections?
I would say if you're working in your garden and it involves pruning, cutting, if your hands come into contact with plants, those are relevant things, and it depends on the type of virus, whether they're mechanically transmitted or not. If they are not mechanically transmitted, it doesn't make much difference. So there are a few viruses that are mechanically transmitted, such as tobacco mosaic virus, that you need to be aware of. The rest of the viruses is not going to have much effect on sanitizing your tools. Common sanitizing things are bleach at 5 to 10% for 5-10 minutes, but your tool should be wiped fairly clean if you do that. Otherwise, the activity of the bleach will be taken up by, say, soil particles, plant debris, things like that, rather than surface sterilizing the tool itself. Hydrogen peroxide will work. It's less stinky, tends not to bleach things out as nastily. But if you're going to use at least bleach on tools, you have to make sure that you dip them in some kind of rinse water before you use them again, because bleach is also damaging to plant surfaces if it's an herbaceous type of plant. Woody plants, not so much.
Okay. There's a question that's specific, but I think there's a general form of it too, at least which I have. The specific question is, what is the best way to get rid of peach leaf curl? And I think that I know that peach leaf curl is not a viral problem, but is there any way to comment both specifically on that, if you can, peach leaf curl, and how does a gardener, is it just a matter of experience to know when damage is viral versus bacterial or fungal? And, do you throw the whole book at everything, or is identifying your diseases ends up being pretty important? And sorry that I generalized your question there. Who asked that? Dorinda, but her starting question was, how do you control for peach leaf curl?
Well, the answer is most of the time you can. It's not a very satisfactory answer, I'm sorry. And you can look this up, the type you see in peach leaf curl, if I go too fast or I don't cover things I should have. But the fungus is actually present inside the leaves and in the overwintering bud scales. The bud scales are the things that surround the growth point that will become the flowers or the leaves the following year. What you want to do is, after a growing season, and presumably after the leaves have fallen off, because they leave behind leaf scars where a fungus could possibly enter. Sometimes the leaves don't fall before the first rains come, but we want to put on an application of finely divided copper. They used to call it microcop, and there are other copper compound materials that you can use, and spray that on your peach tree, which has lost its leaves optimally, and before the rains come, because the fungus is present on the buds that are going to come out the next year. If the buds expand and the scales open up, the fungus can get into those new shoots, what will be new shoots, and infect the leaves, and possibly even developing peaches at that time. So one time before the rains come, and use some kind of agent. Most compounds come with it, but a spreader sticker, which causes the microcop to stick to the plant tissue more effectively and not be washed off as early, that should be a component of your spray. And then again, after the rains have started, but before the buds swell, and this is kind of those catch-22. How can I tell when the buds are going to swell? Well, you just take a look at them when they're very tight, and if it looks like there's any movement, put on a second application of that copper compound. It's not 100% effective, but if you make your timing correct, you should still be able to get a crop. And as far as other bacterial diseases, aside from perhaps fire blight and some that enter through flowers, you know, when the flowers open up, the insects carry the bacteria around, rain splash may spread the bacteria from flower to flower. Aside from those, we don't have many bacterial diseases because our climate is so dry. So by and large, we don't worry about bacteria too much. The viruses will not produce a, well, they call it fire blight because it looks like the shoes have been burned. Viruses generally don't produce that kind of symptom. And as far as fungi are concerned, frequently, not always, but frequently, fungi produce signs. Okay, as we said, symptoms, that's what the plant does in response to the pathogen. But signs are actually the pathogen itself. So we have powdery mildew. That powdery looking stuff on the leaf surface is fungus tissue. That's a sign. If there is a sign, the actual pathogen itself, it is not a virus. So if you see fuzzy things, if you see fruiting bodies like the powdery mildew, that's little black specks on the surface of leaves, not a virus. So there are times when the different diseases will distinguish themselves from viruses. Not always. Most plant fungal and bacterial diseases, if they're widely infected all over the plant, it's going to look perhaps systemic. But a lot of diseases, especially fungi, start in a certain place and spread to other places rather slowly. So the systemic nature of viral infections and the rapidity with which symptoms show up throughout the plant is an important differentiation between that and fungi, especially, sometimes bacteria as well.
Well, great. Thank you for that. I think there's so far just a couple last questions. One is in reference to the copper and the sticker spreader. Did you say that it was ineffective to use those before leaves drop off? They have to be used after leaf drop?
It's not as good. If we're talking about optimal, it would be you'd want to cover all the leaf scars. That's where the leaf is attached to the stem. You'd want to be able to cover those sites as well. But the thing is, if the season's moving along, it looks like rain's coming, it's better to spray and get that in before the rain, because on dry tissue, the compound will dry down more easily than if the tissue's already wetted. So that's kind of important. So it's better to do it than not do it. But if the leaves have not fallen off, then you got to remember you're going to want to come back, especially if you have a dry stretch in there somewhere, not too long after the plant dropped its leaves, and try another one, and then do your second spray. That way maybe result in 3 sprays. That way, one, well, the leaves are still on there and maybe yellow but haven't dropped yet. Another one they fully dropped, another one later on before the buds swell.
Okay, good. And then Anne asks, if a person is still getting roses, but they are infected, should they be removed, or is it okay to keep them as long as one cleans the tools between pruning? So I assume this means that the roses are still a nice addition to the garden, but Anne knows they're infected, and can she manage the problem by doing good sanitation and so forth, or is her best course of action to actually get rid of the roses?
This is where human emotions come into play, aside from the purely quote unquote scientific considerations. If it's the rose you truly love, your mom gave it to you, it has sentimental value, it's been in the family garden for generations, and it may be a consideration, if it's not too severely affected by rose mosaic virus, to keep that plant or find another source that's virus free to replace it. Uh, it, it Rose mosaic virus, if you go up and look in the university rose garden, you'll find that a fairly high percentage of those roses have rose mosaic virus. And yet there are visitors and they're that sort of thing. It may be that some roses are less affected than others, and that would be difficult to determine. I don't think a lot of people post that sort of thing. So in the university garden, probably when they went through their pruning, there's not a lot of awareness of spreading the virus. So it's everywhere. But if you did take care not to use your tools between plants, as long as you're aware which ones are affected and which ones are not, it shouldn't spread the virus around very much. You don't want any plant-to-plant contact either. You know, branches from one plant rub on another one. The virus can be transmitted that way as well. So I think it can be managed, especially if the symptoms are not so severe that, you know, oh, these flowers look like somebody took a blowtorch to them, or they just don't look like roses. And in that case, you probably want to get rid of the rose. But otherwise, you may be able to manage okay.